Good afternoon. Dispositions for Peacemaking, Lessons from the Ulster Project. We should begin with defining two terms in our title. A disposition is a mental state of being or a tendency of spirit. And the Ulster Project is a nonprofit organization working for peace in Northern Ireland. Now here we are sitting in the Republic of Korea, so we know something of being in a divided land. The island of Ireland and the Korean Peninsula bear a lot in common. Long periods of colonization, forced migrations, forced subjugations of people, and nationalistic movements in the early 20th centuries that began a process of independence. But just as Korea is divided into North and South today, so too there is a separate Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which remains a part of the United Kingdom. And while the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 brought an end to a lot of the violence that had perpetuated through the 20th centuries in Northern Ireland, there still remains the need for the Ulster Project because peace and reconciliation is an elusive goal. It was in the midst of a violent and segregated Northern Ireland in the 1970s that a Church of Ireland priest, Kerry Waterstone, had an epiphany. Actually, he had his epiphany while he was in the United States on a pastoral exchange. Because in the United States, he was able to speak freely of the troubles at home, the violence, the segregation in Northern Ireland, without fear of violence or reprisal against himself. And so he reasoned if he could bring Protestant and Catholic teenagers from Northern Ireland to the United States in that environment, there might be a chance to get at the root cause of some of the issues in Northern Ireland, to start to problematize the discriminatory attitudes, the prejudicial beliefs that each side had towards each other. Because in Northern Ireland, segregated communities were the rule then. Catholics and Protestants living in entirely separate areas and cities. Cities divided by rivers or divided by clear breaks. And there was no meaningful interaction between the two sides. But in the US, Father Waterstone reasoned that there was a chance for some meaningful interaction. And so in 1975, he established the very first Ulster Project, bringing a small handful of Protestant and Catholic teenagers from Northern Ireland to the US. And he designed that first project in quite a brilliant way. First, he paired communities where, in the United States, teenagers who were demonstrated leaders within their communities were selected as host teens along with their families. And in the Northern Irish communities, again, already established leaders within their communities were selected to travel to the US for this program. So he already had a head start by choosing students, 15 and 16-year-old children from Northern Ireland in the US who were ready for the work. Second, he established a curriculum for the program that was called Adventure Sharing. In each week of the 4 weeks of the Ulster Project program, there would be small groups of Protestant and Catholic, boys and girls, Americans and Northern Irish teens that would come together and would do the hard work of directly confronting the prejudicial attitudes, the negative stereotypes they had against one another in a safe environment led by a counselor. Lastly, he designed the program so that actually the majority of the time spent over the 4 weeks of the Ulster Project is actually very, very fun. Fun experiences for the teenagers to enjoy spending time with one another, to begin to establish friendships if they could, along with some meaningful community service projects. That was the model of the very first project in 1975 that continues to this day. And as of now, over 6,000 Northern Irish teenagers have traveled back and forth to the US and have taken the relationships they created back to their Northern Irish communities. You might be wondering my involvement in all of this. And so if you see the 15-year-old boy in the blue leisure suit, that's me, in my Ulster Project variety show with my adventure sharing group mates back when I was 15. Here I am making my singing debut on the stage. So I was a host teen for 2 summers. I went on to become a counselor for 3 summers as a university student. My older sister is here on a 4th of July float advertising the Ulster Project within our community. So my family has been involved in the Ulster Project going back to 1993. The Ulster Project, again, it continues today, and while the violence has begun to dissipate, certainly when I was a host teen and a counselor, the violent cycle in Northern Ireland was ongoing. The troubles were still afoot. But it was my experience going through the Ulster Project that allowed me, as an American teenager, to gain insight into cycles of violence, how you can have violent actions perpetrated against communities, discriminatory behaviors against people that you maybe have never met before and don't know anything about, built on a foundation of prejudicial attitudes against those people. And at the very bottom, serving as the foundation of all of it, effectively, ignorance. Because again, the communities in Northern Ireland were physically segregated. The Catholic teenagers had gone to school surrounded by Catholic friends. They had never meaningfully interacted with Protestants before. And the same was true for the Protestant teenagers who came over. As an American teen, this was an experience that I could have never, ever had in my own community. And to play a part in the establishment of those relationships was a life-changing experience for me. And it taught me lessons that I have held dear to me and continue to impact my life. And so I'd like to share 2 dispositions with you today for how to become a peacemaker that I learned through my experience, and that I would like to share how you yourselves can discover and develop ways to be peacemakers yourselves. The first disposition of being a peacemaker is to be open-minded. Now, what was very clear in our very first adventure sharing meetings that we had is that the Northern Irish teenagers were not open-minded in the beginning. And when I was a teacher and was teaching sociology and psychology and theory of knowledge classes, I used to teach my students about the concept of a life map from prominent psychologist M. Scott Peck. So I'd like to explain that analogy and how it connects. So a life map is very simple. It's a map that we all have with prominent features of our values, our beliefs, our norms, our language, and all the cultural components that we're surrounded by as children that become a part of how we understand our world and how we understand our place in it. The problems with our life maps is that they are given to us. They're given to us by our families, by our culture, by our education, by the media that we're surrounded by, and they are inherently inaccurate in some ways, and they are incomplete. So to extend the analogy, we can see here, this is a map of our school campus drawn by my 6-year-old son. So if you were a visitor to our campus and you had this map from a grade 1 boy, you can find the grade 1 classrooms easily. You can see the soccer field, and you can see the deli where you could get a snack. But beyond that, probably you would be lost. All right, here is a map of our campus from my 9-year-old daughter that has a little bit more detail on it. You can see more, and again, if you were a visitor to our campus and you had this map, you would be able to find your way a little bit more accurately. Probably not as well as if you had this, our campus map from our school website, and probably not as well again as you have from this, the drone image of our campus from above, taken by our former teacher, Mr. Jason Reagan. The point is, our life maps, when they're given to us, we have values and beliefs that in many ways make sense as children, right? You may have been taught that you should not talk to strangers when you are a young child, and that's maybe appropriate as a child. But if you were to transfer that into adulthood, that would cause some problems as an adult if you were afraid to ever interact with someone who you did not have a pre-existing relationship with. And so we have to be dedicated to the truth and be dedicated to revising our life map so that we go from the image of my 6-year-old son here to something a little bit more approaching reality, if we want to navigate our way through our lives so that we have the authority and the ability to make our own effective decisions and to affect the society around us in ways to make lives better for ourselves and for other people. Right? And so what we found in the Ulster Project with our adventure sharing sessions is that the Protestant and Catholic teenagers coming to us from Northern Ireland, their life maps were so incomplete. They had never meaningfully interacted with one another. And so they had these negative stereotypes about each other because they had never had the experience of actually meeting someone from the other side. And so over the course of the 4 weeks of the project, we could see their minds open. They were exposed to the humanity of each other. And again, over the 4 weeks, most of the activities that the students were doing were fun. They were fun things. They were going to baseball games and going on shopping trips, going to cultural sites. But it was in the adventure sharing meetings where we did the hard work, digging in, sort of showing our life maps to each other, showing the negative stereotypes that each group had against one another, and getting closer to an understanding of reality. So being open-minded was the very first disposition that is essential in order to become a peacemaker. You have to admit that your life map is not accurate, and you have to be willing to revise it, which is an incredibly painful process, and we would see that time and again with the teenagers in the Ulster Project. A lot of them wanted to hold on to the negative stereotypes, to the prejudicial attitudes that they held, because revising a life map is difficult. You believed, many of you, in Santa Claus when you were young, and you probably didn't want to give up that belief. A lot of times we see people, when they're confronted with new information, they'll not only reject new information, they'll actually fight against it and call it heretical and call it wrong, and it is a challenge. But in order to be a peacemaker, you have to be open-minded, and you have to be willing to problematize the values and the beliefs that you may have always held as just being inherently objectively true. The second disposition, and one that is probably even more difficult, is to be open-hearted. So open-minded is, again, is being open to new ideas. Being open-hearted is recognizing the humanity in each other and in all of us. So, in our adventure sharing meetings, the Northern Irish teens, what became very, very clear, especially, again, I was a counselor back when the troubles were ongoing, we were seeing teenagers who were witnesses to violence, who had family members who were involved in terrorist attacks, in bombings, who in some cases had PTSD themselves from living through the troubles, from living in communities where there was fear. Part of the project, we encouraged the American teenagers to travel to Northern Ireland. I had the joy to go to my sister community in Northern Ireland, Derry/Londonderry, 3 times, and seeing the segregation, witnessing it firsthand, being on the Catholic side of town, visiting my Catholic friends, and then saying the wrong name. They can't even agree on the name of their cities. Catholics call it Derry, Protestants call it Londonderry, and I was in the Derry side, and I said Londonderry, and I had to run. And I jumped in a black taxi that's a Catholic taxi, and so he wouldn't even take me to the Protestant side of town where I was staying with a friend, and to be there and to feel that and to witness that gave me insight into the challenge that the Northern Irish teens faced living in that environment every single day. And hearing through the adventure sharing, hearing the teenagers making themselves vulnerable and sharing their experiences as victims of discrimination, witnesses to violence, the effect on their families, made an incredible impact. So I'd like to close with a story, and this is the story of our final, this is a story that we would tell at the end of all of our adventure sharing sessions. This is the picture from the last year that I was a counselor with the Ulster Project, and this picture was taken before our final adventure sharing meeting, because at the end of it, we were emotional messes. The story, while very, very cheesy, might give you a sense of why that is. So to really hammer home the point of not only being open-minded, but to be open-hearted, this was the story we would close with. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, there lived a people who were just like you and I, but they had one special ability. They could open up their chests, and they could share their hearts. In this village, in this land, there was one young man who would travel from village to village, and as a means of making money for himself, he would challenge anyone in the village to come up and to compare and bet that their heart was more beautiful than his, because he knew that his heart was the most beautiful. And he would go to village, and he would go to the center of the town, and he would challenge the villagers, and they would come out, and he would open his chest, and he would show his heart. And everyone would always agree, and they would always lose the bet, that his heart was the most beautiful. It was the perfect color, it was the perfect shape, it was the perfect size. All features of the heart were absolute perfection, everyone would agree, and that's how the young man would make his living. And one day, he went to a village, and he did as he normally did, went to the center of the town, issued his challenge to the villagers. A few dared to challenge and lost their money because everyone agreed the young man's heart was the most beautiful. And at the end of the day, an old woman stepped out from the crowd, and she said, "Excuse me, young man, but my heart is more beautiful than yours." And the town people looked at the old woman, and a few of them laughed, a few of them scoffed, because they knew that the old woman had lived a very difficult life. And they knew there was no way that the old woman's heart could be anywhere approaching the young man's. The young man said, "Okay, woman, if you insist." And so he opened his chest and he pulled out his heart that again everyone had seen and in its perfection. And the old woman opened her chest and pulled out her heart, and it was exactly as all the people, the townsfolk, feared. It was hideous, and it was pockmarked, and it was scarred. And so there was a gasp from the people, townsfolk, being confronted with this heart. And the young man laughed in the face of the old woman and said, "Woman, put that away. Why are you subjecting us to that? Your heart is the ugliest heart I've ever seen. Why would you challenge me in this way? I'm sad for you." And the old woman, still holding her heart, said, "No, young man, I'm sad for you, because this scar on my heart is where my heart was broken, where I tried to give it to someone else, and I couldn't. And this discoloration here, this is where I received a piece of the heart from my son who died. And this piece, this missing, is where I gave a piece to him. And yes, my heart is scarred and it's ugly, but that's because I've lived my life giving to others. And you have never stooped so low to ever share yourself with anyone else." And the townsfolk were quiet, and the young man was quiet. And then finally, he took a piece of his perfect heart and ripped out a chunk, and he gave it to the old woman. And he thanked her for the lesson. And hearing the Northern Irish teenagers sharing with each other all of the challenges they faced in their communities and how brave they were to create relationships with one another, it was life-changing work. And to go to Northern Ireland and to see those relationships across geographic boundaries, across religious boundaries, across cultural boundaries, as actual living lights of hope, driving the peace process forward there. Having heard the pain of, again, they're witnessing violence and they're being the victims of discrimination, and yet they stood up in the face of that and were willing to share with one another. People who they, at the start of the month, viewed as the enemy. Again, it was life-changing, and it taught me that lesson. In order to be a peacemaker in our communities, where even if though we don't have racial divisions, or maybe we don't have the cultural divides that they have in Northern Ireland, we still see people as other than us. We still see people as different from who we are. We still don't recognize the humanity in everyone around us. But we can discover the ability to be open-minded. We can discover our life maps and problematize them. We can develop the ability to be open-hearted and to see the humanity in one another and to connect with one another in ways that allow us to be peacemakers in our own communities. So that's my challenge to you. In the same spirit as those brave Northern Irish teenagers that for decades and decades have done the hard work and have reached across boundaries that they never would have otherwise done. Become a peacemaker in your community. Be open-minded, be open-hearted, and you can help create those bridges across our communities and connect with one another and bring peace. Thank you.